Ladies and gentlemen, welcome to our Tuesday night class after a long break. And now that we went through all the Yom Tovim, we could wish each other we should have a very, very good, blessed, and healthy year. The topic of tonight's lecture, the question was about naming a child after somebody that either passed away young or somebody that died a natural death. And I thought to give a little bit of an overview of Jewish names in Judaism, because for us it's a very, very deep subject, which is much more than for many, many other nations. For us, names have legal, spiritual connotation. When it comes to legal aspects of it, volumes and volumes are written on every aspect, starting from laws of giving names to legal documents, how names are being written in legal documents, such as in the kesubos, marriage documents and divorce documents. And it's a real science. And today, as always, we're talking about a subject that could be spoken about a whole course. We'll talk about it for a year and not go to the end. But tonight we'll just talk about some of the main aspects, and we'll touch upon the question at hand also. So first of all, we know that in the book of Bereshis, which we began just now, we started the Torah from the beginning. We're talking about how Adam Harishon, he gave names to all the animals. And the Kabbalists tell us that it wasn't just a name as in other languages. For example, we can think why in English a dog is a dog or cat is a cat. In other languages, in Judaism, it's a very mystical concept that each letter is a godly energy that actually is invested in everything to be able to create that particular object and to be able to keep it alive. So he saw not just a particular name that it should be given for whatever reason. He saw the godly energies that are invested in each particular animal, each particular being, each particular creation. And based on that, he has given those names. So here we come to the concept of names generally. We see that in Tanakh, in the Bible, every time a name was given in the beginning, it was given as it was an original name, like a primordial name, which was given for particular reasons, particular circumstances, particular events. You open up and you see with everybody. With Adam is because he came from the Adama, from the earth. Chava represents vitality. And then we come to everybody, Abraham, Avraham, why he was given that name in the beginning and why it was changed in order to change his mazel, Sarah. All of the tribes from whom we come. If you look in the Torah, it's going to be in a couple of weeks, we're going to read about the birth of all the 12 tribes, and we see that each and every one of them was connected to particular circumstances with which he was born. And today we see that we don't just create names. Today we have a particular customs, how names are chosen. Either we name a child after somebody, after a particular grandparent or an ancestor or a personality, could be a righteous person or somebody from the Bible, or name could have a very positive component. It means something very positive, and the parents want, but it's a name which exists in Tanakh. And those are some of the thoughts that come into giving the names. It reminds me of a story that one time a husband and a wife come to a rabbi and having a huge fight. And the rabbi says, why are you fighting? So they tell him that we had a baby boy and we're having a fight because says the father, I want to name him after my father, and the wife wants to name after her father. So the rabbi asks the husband, what's your father's name? He says his name is Moshe. And what's your name? He says to the mother, she says his name is Moshe also. They say, why are you fighting? Should be no problem over here. Moshe. So the mother tells him, you don't understand. My father was such a refined human being, such a righteous person. And his father was some kind of a low life. He was a drunk. He was a ganav. So the rabbi saw who he was dealing with. So he says, you know what? I have an idea. Call him Moshe. And when he grows up, you'll see if he's named after her father or after his father. So all of these concepts, all of these thoughts, they go after naming a child. Now, in Judaism, in Jewish law, there's a concept of Shemus Kodesh, of names which come from the holy tongue or holy names. And generally speaking, there are either names which come from the Tanakh, from the Bible, or names that develop later, but they come from the holy tongue. We see name Avraham, Yitzchak, Yaakov, Reuven, Shimon, Ephraim. And then we have names that came later, like Hillel, and names after Dov, Zev, Arya. We see that animals had a very important role in Judaism, where we are told that some animals have very positive traits, and Jews are compared to the animals. It says in the Bible that, for example, Benjamin was compared to a wolf, and Yehuda to a lion, and Naphtali was compared to a deer, or to the animal from that family. And those names are called Shemas Kodesh, holy names. And then also at the same time, there were names that began to be developed that are called Kinui Laz. They like nicknames, but they come the Jewish names, but they came from a language that was used by Jewish people in different countries. Let's talk about Ashkenazi Jews, because many of us come from Eastern Europe. So names which came from Yiddish, for example. And a lot of times, those names were a translation or a parallel of the Hebrew name in Yiddish. So, for example, if a person was called Yehuda, so his nickname in Eastern Europe for generations was Leib, which means lion. Yehuda was compared to a lion, and he was called Leib. The famous Maharal of Prague, his name was Yehuda, and his name in Yiddish, in Germanic Yiddish, was similar to Leib, which means a lion. And in the beginning, the names which were given to a child were given to him at birth, and I'll tell you in a second how names are given. And at the same time, at home, he was called affectionately by the Kinu, by the Yiddish translation. Now, before we go there, how are names given? So again, a custom developed, which became a norm in Jewish communities. A name is, for boy, is given at a time of his bris, a time of circumcision. There's also a mystical reason for it. When a bris is pushed off for a short amount of time, a name is also pushed off. You wait to give a name until the bris, and you don't publicize the name that you want to give until the bris. Sometimes I'm asked the question that for whatever reason, if God forbid the baby cannot have a bris, not just on time, but it has to push it for a long time, sometimes for months. And it always happens only because of one reason. And that reason is actually more than one reason. I'll tell you in a minute, the second reason, which happened during COVID, but the main reason is health reasons. So if you have a child that is suffering from a sickness that is dangerous for him to have a bris, the bris has to be pushed off according to Jewish law. Another reason which happened now during COVID, and I was asked from a number of countries in Asia, there was no moil. The countries were closed. We're talking about Singapore, Thailand, Hong Kong, China, Japan. Those countries were closed for quite a number of months. And the question which I was asked was, should we use a non-Jewish or secular doctor to do a bris, and afterwards do maybe a touch of a needle, or should we wait for a kosher moil? And I answered categorically that we have to wait for a kosher moil, even if the bris is pushed up. As important as it is not to push up a bris, but it's very, very crucial to have the right person who is qualified to perform the bris. So in such a case, when the bris is pushed up for many months, sometimes we do allow for name to be given earlier, but that's, like I said before, it's an exception. The general rule is for a boy, you give a name at his bris. For what about a girl? The custom developed and became a universal custom, that a name is given to a girl at a time when you read the Torah in the synagogue, because that is a time when people gather together. The Torah is read 3 times a week, normally, except for on other special days. The Torah is read on Shabbos, on Monday and Thursday. And the question is, when is the right time to give a name to a girl? In some communities, they wait until the first Shabbos. But the reality is that according to Kabbalah and according to our custom, you give a name as soon as possible. And sometimes I'm asked by a couple, should wait until the mother is able to come out from the hospital. The answer is no. You can make later a kiddush, you can make a party, but it's correct to give a name connected with the entrance of the neshama into the body. For a boy, a very significant part of his neshama enters during the bris, during the circumcision. For a girl, it enters when you give her a Jewish name. And that is why it's in our custom, it's important to do it as soon as possible and not to wait until even one extra day. So if she was born on Sunday night, you give it Monday morning. And if she was born on Tuesday, you give it on Thursday because it's the closest day. And you don't have to wait till Shabbos. So that's when you give the name. Among Ashkenazi Jews, the custom has developed that for girls, they used to give Yiddish names from very beginning, already for hundreds and hundreds of years in the Middle Ages. But for boys, they would give, usually at a bris, they would give them what's called a Shem Kodesh, a name in a holy tongue, a holy name. And they would give a nickname in Yiddish. So for example, again, they would call him Yehuda, and at home they would call him Leib or Label. They would call him Dov, which means a bear, and they would call him at home Ber or Beryl, affectionately. Sometime approximately 400 years ago, they started to give double names at actual bris. So the name became consisting of both the Kodesh, the holy tongue, and the vernacular, which was the Yiddish name. And already in the 20th century, probably post-Holocaust, it already became customary sometimes to give just a Yiddish name, which wasn't a custom before the war. Before the war, they would at least give a Yiddish name together with a Hebrew name. I think the custom developed because a lot of times when fathers would come to give a name to the child, they would call it after their grandfather, for example. And the grandfather was called, everybody called him Beryl at home. But his name at the bris could have been Dov or Yisachar Dov or anything, Chaim Dov. And because everybody knew his name is Beryl, so that's what they thought it was. We actually have a yard site today in our community. Somebody from here, somebody that I knew very well, passed away at the age of almost 100 years old. And everybody thought his name was Hirsch Leib. Hirsch means in Yiddish a deer, and Leib means a lion. But he himself told me before he passed away that his father's name was Tzvi Aryeh. Tzvi Aryeh is the Hebrew name, and everybody called him Hirsch Leib. So this is how names have developed. What constitutes a Shem Kodesh? A Shem Kodesh is a name that, like I said before, that comes either from the Bible, from Tanakh, or it's a name which developed in the Holy Tongue. But there's some exceptions. For example, believe it or not, the name Alexander became considered to be a holy name. Even compared to a Yiddish name, which is also a Jewish name, it became a holy name. And the question why, and according to most opinions, there is a Gemara in Yuma, a Talmud, a tractate in Talmud, which talks about how Alexander the Great, when he's conquering the world, he was the emperor of the Greek Empire, and whenever he used to come to a particular place, people were very much afraid because he used to conquer the land. A lot of times he used to act quite violently and aggressively with the nations that he conquered. But for whatever reason, he showed a lot of closeness and goodwill to the Jewish people. The Talmud says that when he saw the high priest, he recognized that this high priest, Shimon HaTzadik, would bless him, come to him in a vision before his battles and bless him. And the story goes that as a result of the pact which the Jewish people made with Alexander the Great and the goodwill between them, they've elevated the name Alexander to be a Hebrew name, like the same status as a Hebrew name, to the extent that it even has a Yiddish component. Yiddish component usually comes together with a some holy name, Hebrew name. So just like a name, Shlomo has a name Zalman as a Yiddish component. So Alexander has a name Sender. Sender became like a Yiddish component for the name Alexander. So this is how it's interesting how names developed. So I was asked the question, can people make up a name? Is there anything wrong just to come and make up a name? In Israel, it became a very, very trendy thing to do. The answer is it's not a very advisable thing to take a name which didn't exist before, because names they have a very, very deep meaning. And when you just take a word and you create a name out of it, sometimes you could make a mistake. Names came from very, very deep sources. But again, sometimes you have a name which is developed and becomes already embedded into the Jewish nation, and it becomes a custom to use that name. I'll tell you an interesting story that happened here in Sydney 30-something years ago. There was a couple here in Sydney. They davened in one of the shuls. At the time, my colleague Rabbi Gutnik was a rabbi in that particular shul. And the lady, the young wife, she never was given a Jewish name. And her name was Leonie. That was her English name. And she wanted to actually receive a Hebrew name. The Lubavitcher Rebbe a lot of times was asked by people who didn't have a name what name to take. Sometimes he would instruct them to choose their own name. Obviously, he trusted them, they would come to the right decision. And sometimes he would tell them which name to take when asked him. And you can see that there was a certain system by which he's given the name. Because we know that generally the Kabbalists tell us that when parents give a name to the child, it's given with divine inspiration. When a name is chosen generally, it's not by accident, it's not a fluke. So that's why we don't change names easily. And so this young lady decided to write to the Rebbe and to ask him, what name should I choose? Now, in truth, she liked the name Ariella. But she was embarrassed to write to the Rebbe about this name because she thought it's a very untraditional name, unconventional name. It's like a modern name. And she thought maybe the right thing to take a more traditional name, like Sarah, Rivka, Rochel, Leah, like one of the, very, very traditional Jewish names. And at the end, she decided she would not write to the Rebbe what she wants. She was embarrassed to mention the name Ariella. And all she wrote to the Rebbe was that, my name is Leonie, and I would like to know which name I should choose, which Jewish name I should choose for myself. And the fax in those days, we used to get answers from the Rebbe through faxes, and the secretary would send the fax, and the faxes arrived with which I saw myself, and the Rebbe wrote La'achroina nispashet Hashem Ariella. Lately, it became a common among Jewish people to use the name Ariella. That's what the Rebbe told us. He must have felt that that's the name she wanted, obviously, or he felt that that's the name that belongs to her, because the fact that she wanted it also wasn't a coincidence. So you see that a lot depends on custom. We also find that at a certain point, Jewish people started to give one name or two names. It wasn't anymore a carved in stone to give only one name. We don't see this, by the way, in Tanakh, in the Bible, or even in the Talmud. You don't see it. You see that the general custom was to give only one name. Sometimes a person would have two names just because he was known in one country by one name, or in a different country by a different name, or he would be named under certain circumstances with one name, like Jacob. Jacob was called Yaakov, and he received a name Yisrael, but he was never called Yaakov Yisrael. He was always called in the Bible either Yaakov or Yisrael. But at a certain point, there also became a custom to give two names if the parents want. It wasn't necessarily custom to give two names over one name. One name was just as good. But a lot of times they give two names for whatever reason, either because they already gave it after somebody or after two grandfathers. Sometimes those names, double names, they made a lot of times the combination makes a lot of, also has a very special meaning in it. For example, people might have seen, it's a very common combination to call somebody Binyamin Ze'ev. This was the name of Theodor Herzl. His Hebrew name was Benjamin Ze'ev. The reason why it's or Yehuda Arya, because those particular second name represented the animal that was compared to the particular personality in the Bible. So Benjamin was compared to a wolf, and Yehuda, Judah, was compared to a lion, and those names come together. What we find was that generally speaking, we are discouraged, not generally, but we're always discouraged to give a name with a negative connotation. When somebody, for example, we don't give a name like a dog or a cat, there's or a name which has a negative aspect to it, a cruel aspect to it, for example. The Talmud tells us that Rabbi Meir Daig Bishmo, a great sage who lived about 1900 years ago or 1800 years ago, he used to be very particular about names. So it says that he was traveling with two of his colleagues, and they stayed in a particular inn. And the two of his colleagues, they deposited the money with the inn owner, with the balabos. And Rabbi Meir refused to do it. And he said that the name of the owner of the hotel reflects on immoral behavior. And at the end of the day, the person did steal the money from the other two rabbis. They managed to get it back only through very creative ingenuity. But they said to Rabbi Meir, you were right. We should have listened to you and not deposited the money with him. So we see that name does have a certain type of a connection to a person. And because of that, because the name itself, and because the giving of a Jewish name is such a vital part of our culture, of our religion, of our being, so therefore a name is not changed at a whim. I remember many times in the beginning we used to give names to members of the community. I mean, the parents would choose a name after grandmother, after a member of the family, and sometimes the names were Yiddish names. Like a girl would get a name Perl or Razel, and when they would come to a Jewish school, for some reason the Hebrew teacher who taught them Hebrew thought it was a mistake, that you have to have a Hebrew name, and if they have a Yiddish name, it has to be translated into Hebrew. So they would come and try to force the child to say your name is not Perl, but it's Pnina, which means pearl in Hebrew. Your name is not Razel, but Shoshana. And it's a very big mistake, because once a name has the status of a Jewish name, it becomes connected to the neshama of the person. And to come along and to change it, doesn't matter whether changing it from Yiddish to Hebrew, from Hebrew to Yiddish, that's not a positive thing. That's not the name of the person. It's two separate names. Sometimes they're used as in combination. That's true. But when they're given separately, they're two separate names. Sometimes it's interesting that as much as the Yiddish, when the names are traditionally given in pairs, sometimes we have to think much deeper to understand what is behind it. So the examples I've given you are very simple examples. But let's take a more complicated example. There's a very famous name called Menachem Mendel. Menachem is a name which means a comforter, and Mendel is a Yiddish component. And usually Mendel is always part of Menachem. They're connected to each other. And the question is, what is the connection between them? So I saw in one of the sources a very interesting connection between them. The name Menachem in Jewish literature, in the Talmud, is connected to the redemption, to the concept of redemption. Because Mashiach, Messiah, will comfort the Jewish people from all the tragedies and problems of the exile. So as a matter of fact, the Talmud says that Menachem is one of the possible names of Mashiach is Menachem. And Mendel in Yiddish comes from the word Mandel, which means almonds, shkedim. And in the Torah, shkedim are type of a nut that flourishes very, very quick, very swiftly, much faster than other species. And according to this source, Mendel was meant to be a component. First of all, they're similar because they have the same first letter, Menachem and Mendel. And Mendel hints to us that the Geula, that the redemption will come very, very fast, very swiftly. So before I get to the question at hand, I want to say that somebody once wrote that it's not a good thing to give a name which could be given to both boys and girls. There are a few names in Hebrew that both male and female names. For example, name Simcha, or the name Yoina. Yoina means a dove. It's interesting that with Ashkenazi Jews, the names Simcha and Yoina usually were given to boys, and with many Sephardi Jews, it was given mainly to girls. But today, because we're living in a world where everything is intermingled, and Ashkenazim and Sephardim, they mix together, so you see that sometimes it goes both ways. But again, we have to see the custom. The fact is that nobody today, the great rabbis are called Simcha, and great rabbis called Yoina, and great Jewish people called by these names. And therefore, when a particular opinion is raised that goes against the custom, we see that Jewish people didn't accept that opinion, and they give those names quite without any reservation. The reason why the question was asked, I will finish with that, and afterwards we'll have some questions if anybody has them. The question was asked about giving a name after somebody that had a bad mazel. So there is, even though Jewish people are not very superstitious, and usually we believe that it's something that, the less you are worried about those things, the less they will damage you. But we see that there is such a concept does exist in our sources. And therefore, there was a very old idea that when somebody wants to change the mazel, sometimes, and it must be done with proper advice. A person should never ever do it himself. But we see that sometimes names were changed to change one's mazel. And the first source of this idea actually comes from the portion of the Torah we read last Shabbos. When God told Abraham, who was called Avram without a hey, that he was already quite an old man and he never had children. And Hashem said to him before his circumcision that until now you were called Avram, will change your name to Avraham, and this will change your mazel. And if Avram wasn't able to have children, Avraham will have children. And the same thing is said about his wife Sarah. Her name was Sarai, with a yud at the end. And Hashem said her name will become Sarah. And Hashem himself, by the way, from here you can see what sort of advice you have to change names. Abraham wouldn't do it if Hashem would advise him to do it. So we should really ask experts before we do such a thing. Today, in most cases, the name is added. It's not changed completely, but another name is added and usually it's done when somebody is very, very ill. It's called Shem Machmas Choili. It's a concept of adding a name because of a sickness. And specifically in this day and age, we are told that we should not, under normal circumstances, again, if a great Rebbe or a great expert tells you otherwise, something else. But normally, we only add a name. We don't actually change the name. And the names that we add, names are added with purpose in mind. So if somebody has an extra name because they are ill, usually you add a name like Chaim, which means life, or Refoel, which means to be healed. A very common name. We had in the last months, there was for Pesach, there was a terrible wave of Jewish people in certain communities that were on ventilators, intubated because of COVID. And some of them were given a name. My wife's brother, his name always was Levi. He's a man of 67 years old. He was intubated for a month. His life was in danger. Doctors at one point said there's not too much hope for him. And the family added a name, Chaim, to his name. He recovered, Baruch Hashem, and today his name is Chaim Levi. There are laws, what happens when a person doesn't survive. When a person doesn't survive, from either he dies within 30 days after the name was added, or he dies from the same sickness, as it doesn't recover, then the name which was added is not used after his passing. So on his tombstone, you only leave the other name. You only leave the new name if a person, God willing, survives. The other example, which I'll tell you an interesting idea, another example when a name is added, there is a old Kabbalistic custom, especially prevalent among European Jews, that we don't have the son-in-law and the father-in-law with the same name. There's certain reasons for it. So what do? In some communities, they wouldn't even make the shidduch. They wouldn't even introduce the couple if the boy's name was the same as the girl's father. But in our community, for example, and this was the opinion of the first Lubavitcher Rebbe and the opinion of our Rebbe, that if a particular if a girl wants to meet a boy and she knows that his name is the same as her father's name, that if at the end they get engaged, at some time before the wedding, at least 30 days before the wedding, the boy adds an extra name to his name. So if, for example, his name was Baruch and his future father-in-law's name is Baruch, so he will add another name before that. He'll name him Shalom Baruch or something. He'll take another name that he likes and does it before. Why does the groom add a name and not the father-in-law? Well, I think it's seniority. The father-in-law had it for longer. So out of respect to him, the younger guy will add a name. But that's not because of mazel, that's a little bit because of mazel also. They say that it'll be, that it's better for the mazel, for the couple, for the home, the family, the building, if the name of the son-in-law and the father-in-law is not the same. But you see that it's a very interesting concept, that once a name is added, it's considered like it's a different name. This is also part, by the way, in Jewish law. If somebody has always known by two names, and you write he's always known as Chaim Baruch, always, people call him by two names, and in the ksuba, you write only one name, it's considered to be a mistake. His name is not Chaim, his name is Chaim Baruch. Two names that make up it becomes like a new entity, a new name. And now we're coming to the question at hand, which I'm asked quite a number of times. Sometimes a member of the family, a grandfather, a great uncle, an uncle, dies tragically from a sickness, from a car accident at a young age. And they're asking, should they name a child after him? And there is something to it. There is a concept in Judaism that it could be a little bit of a concern, that if that person died under tragic circumstances, the giving exactly the same name after him could also take the mazel, especially when you have in mind that person. So you're taking the mazel of the person and giving it to the child. And what we do in such a case, we advise to add another name. If you give a name together with a different name, then again, it already becomes a different mazel. You still have that component. You still give the respect to the person that shares the same name that you named after. But as far as the child is concerned, his mazel is a different mazel. This idea actually comes also from Tanakh, from the Talmud. We know that there was a prophet called Yeshayahu, Isaiah. In Hebrew, it's Yeshayahu. And we see that the custom developed that you name usually children Yeshaya without one letter. The name could have two versions. And we try to change it slightly, even by one letter, because the prophet Isaiah, he suffered a terrible, terrible death, a natural death. And as a result, the custom developed, especially among European Jews, to name the children Yeshaya and not Yeshayahu. Take away just one letter. Recently, I was asked by a rabbi in New York that his son gave birth to a baby girl, and they wanted to name that girl after a relative, I think it was a great aunt, that perished in the Holocaust. And I've sent him a written response based on quite a number of sources that to name after a Holocaust victim is not considered to be in the same category of naming after somebody who had a bad mazel. Because all the Holocaust victims, it's not considered that their perishing and their tragic death is out of bad mazel. It was a global, communal catastrophe, a Holocaust, as Holocaust means a catastrophe, that had some altogether a different meaning that didn't affect individuals as far as the individual mazel, and therefore there is no problem to name somebody after a Holocaust victim, even if that person died at a very young age. I want to finish off by saying that to give a child a Jewish name and to be proud of a Jewish name, it's a very, very lofty and a very important aspect of Yiddishkeit. And we were never embarrassed of Jewish names. As a matter of fact, we are told in Egypt that one of the three things that the Jewish people, as much as they suffered and they lost a lot of the Jewish observance, but one of the three things they've kept was Jewish names. And as a result, we see that Jews always gravitated towards names, some more, some less. In more traditional circles, they always try to give Jewish names as a regular name also, that the child is called by this name. At most, sometimes they would, in a passport, they would translate it to make it similar. Sometimes in America or in Russia, they had certain names that maybe they gave a Jewish name, but they also gave an equivalent English or Russian name, but those names became almost exclusively Jewish. Like you hardly ever see people with that name who were not Jewish. For example, in New York, in America, there was a typical thing that somebody was called either Yisrael or Yitzchok. They called him Isidore or Irving, for example. Isidore, Irving became like almost exclusively Jewish names. Or Max became like, it was a translation. That person always had a Hebrew name or Yiddish name. There are many people called Menachem Mendel, but they in the past, but they were written as Max. But later on, unfortunately, in some places, the Jewish people became very sort of embarrassed of Jewish names, and they started to create real sort of very, very non-Jewish names. And I think that it's a pity because for us, a Jewish name is something to be proud of and something to be able to, it's a legacy we give our children. And therefore, we have to try to encourage ourselves and others to do that. And not to worry so much. People are respected today. People have all kinds of names, and not to think of all kinds of exotic, secular, non-Jewish names around us, but to be proud of our heritage and to give Jewish names that at the same time give us a lot of blessings.